Hello everyone. Today we're just going to do a walkthrough of the item catalog project for the Udacity full stack web developer Nanodegree. So to me this is the coolest project for this Nanodegree, because this is where you actually get to build something that I assume most people that started this, enrolled in this Nanodegree, really wanted to get to the point of being able to do, which is build something on the web that has a backend, so users can log in and modify the data, create some data, and others and themselves can view it and modify it. So, this is essentially the heart of what a web application is, something that, that has that kind of functionality. So, people have ideas from, building something like Facebook to YouTube to almost anything, Twitter, Instagram, anything where you can share the thoughts and ideas that you have in terms of some sort of information, and other people can, interact with it. And so what you really need is to be able to build a website and then have it connected to a backend. And this project, although simplified in quite a few ways, which we'll look at the very least, it allows you to build your very first version of this, a full stack web application. So to me, it's pretty exciting, and I'm sure it is to you guys as well. So as usual, I don't want to just repeat everything that's being said in the videos that you guys already have provided by Udacity. So the real point of this is to walk through the project, walk through some of the most important parts of it, and hopefully give some valuable insight into how to approach it and get the most value out of it. So what we're really going to be looking at is a few ways to look at it and conceptualize what you're doing, and formulate I wouldn't go as far as to say a full-on system design mindset, but at least start getting you to think in that mindset, and develop a way of going about building these applications. And the only way to perfect this is to just continuously build applications. So this is a fantastic start. So, of course, as Lorenzo in the Udacity Flask and OAuth courses mentions, there's a few ways to go about doing it. Some people like to start with the front end, and some people like to start with the back end. So it doesn't really matter. It just depends on your personal preference and what is most important for you, or at the very least, it may end up coming down to what it is that you find important. So if it's the structure of the data that's the most important, then probably you'd start with the backend. If it's how your users interact, then it might be the front end. But to be honest, I think they're so incredibly closely linked that you probably have to do both simultaneously or iteratively, where you start with one, you have a database design, and then you go back and you look at your the front end or the user interface, and you see what people will be looking at, like how people will be working with the data. And then you go back and you make sure, is your backend able to cater for this? So, maybe using a real example. If you had something like a little bit complex, so for example, there's a whole bunch of productivity applications, or let me not just say productivity, that's way too broad, but say ERP, or so enterprise resource planning, or sales software, or sorry, maybe I'm just being distracted by going too broad. Essentially what I'm getting at is, if you use something like, say, SAP or Salesforce or something like that, which is a huge application, which has so many applications within it. that would be when you really have to break your application down into small little things. And the point of me mentioning this is that especially in the beginning, what you want to do is have some basic application going. So for example, even now with Facebook, there's so many things you can do. Especially and it's the same with, say, YouTube and a lot of the products offered by Google. And so if you had an application that you want to do many things, so for example, if you had like a productivity app that does tracking of your work, it maybe does some diagramming, some workflows, then that's going to be biting off way too much. And you probably want to just get back down to some basic functionality. So for example, like what Facebook was in the beginning, a place with a where you could have a basic profile page, profile image, some information about yourself, and then you can make posts. And that would be like a good application to build in the beginning. So whatever your application is that you want to build. So for example, this project, an item catalog, just a good example, a good idea is to just keep it quite simple in the beginning until you're really used to going through the motions of building the application from the back end to the front end. Yeah, sorry. So I just wanted to make that point. Hopefully, yeah, maybe I'll just say it once more to be clear, because it took quite a while to say it. When building applications in the beginning, try and make them simple, even if your end product is not that simple. Try and make a simplified version of it in the beginning. This also follows agile methodologies, where you build something and then you very quickly and iterate through. This seems to be the most successful way. It's not, I guess there's lots of different ways to do it, so I can't prove it's the most successful way. But when you look even at, I think Facebook's, I don't know what you want to call it, motto, I think, was move fast and break things. So the idea is just get something out before you, instead of designing to the nth degree, because as soon as you start building, you realize that the assumptions you had in your design don't actually hold. So that's a good thing to keep in mind when you go about building an application. So this will be the first application, so I thought I'd just mention that in the beginning. So let's assume that you are building something simple. Let's assume that you're just going to do an item catalog, which can be like the exact example that was used in the course by Lorenzo, which is a restaurant menu. It doesn't matter too much until you're really good at building this. It doesn't matter too much what the item catalog is. So I think a lot of people will spend a lot of time trying to build something that's quite unique. And I think it might be a lot better to build something unique once you're really good at, or at least quite competent at building the, say, the restaurant menu application. Once you can do that, it doesn't matter. So say you didn't have a restaurant, you had like a list of hotels, and you could choose the size of the room and the features of the room. For example, it doesn't matter. It's exactly the same as a restaurant. So you might as well just stay with restaurant menus. That's in my opinion. So anyway, one way to go about it is to start to bounce between the front and the back end. So for example, what I've got here is wireframes. So what's useful about this is the most intuitive for most people, in that you don't really start thinking about a back end when you're thinking of a service. You're probably thinking about what you'll interact with and what your users will interact with. So that's why wireframes are pretty cool. You basically just draw your website out, what you think people will look at. So going with the menu items, you just draw your menu, what it looks like, and the information that will be involved in it, and how people will interact with it, and that would be the user interface. From there, sorry, I think I wasn't clear about this as well. These large bullet points are going to be things that we need to think about, but you don't actually have to do for this application, for this project. right? It's just good to have it in your mind when you go about building this project, because for any other project that you do build, you're probably going to want to spend a bit more time on the user interface and how it actually ends up looking. But for the item catalog, it wouldn't be super important. You're just essentially listing information and allowing people, users, to create, read, update, and delete that information. So this is quite important. But so if you're just going to ignore it completely, that's perfectly fine. But just remember that it is there and it is important for nearly every single application that you build. Okay, so that, I think, yeah, I've discussed the wireframes, and then the wireframes are going to be informed by the user interface. So these could be either way. You have your user interface and what people are going to do, and then from there build your wireframes, or build some basic wireframes and see if that they cater to the user interface. Essentially, in some ways, they're almost the same thing. This is just how you actually diagram out what's being done, what each view will look like. Okay, and then you, of course, also related to your user interface is the functionality. So perhaps how things would change. So, for example, something a bit more complex might be, say, for example, a YouTube video. Once a video has been uploaded, the interface is going to change compared to before you've uploaded a video. Or maybe you're not on YouTube to upload videos, you're on YouTube to watch videos, which obviously is most people. This is all going to have to do with, the different users will have different roles, and the functionality of the application will be different for them. So just keep that in mind, as you go about building this item catalog. Okay. The next thing would be the workflows, which, again, like with all of these, is quite related to the functionality. And that's exactly, once you know that there's going to be different functionality for different users, you want to figure out what is the workflow, like how does somebody interact with your application. But this will be there even for the most basic application, the workflow. So for this project, an item catalog, someone is going to log in. They're going to be able to view the data, the different items in your catalog. They may be able to, if it's theirs, the data that they've uploaded, then, well, if they're the owner, then they will be able to add their own items to the catalog. They'll be able to view other people's, but they'll also be able to edit theirs and delete theirs and add new items. So essentially, that would be the workflow for each of the users. So one of the most common ways, let me not say the best way to go about this, is to start with once you understand the workflow, you understand the functionality, you can start, a common way to start is with an entity relationship diagram. So you would have gone through this when you were building, when you did the previous project on SQL. So you're going to build an entity relationship diagram to fully understand the relationship between all the different types of data in your application. It really is a good exercise in just making sure you understand exactly what your application is going to do. Once you've built your entity relationship diagram, it makes the object relational mapper, where you build your objects that will be turned into database tables, super simple, just through Python and Flask specifically in this situation. So that would be a useful order to go about it. Create your entity relationship diagrams, double check that they make perfect sense for every situation. So when you're creating, when you're updating, when you're deleting. And sorry, let me also just go back and say that these steps over here, in the workflows, your entity relationship, the ORM, the Flask views, the templates, authorization, and JSONify. These are the main steps that you need to do to complete this project. Let me also say, sorry, that ERD is not, these are the main steps that I think you need to do. But you don't have to do the ERD. right? It's just that going in and building your object relational mapper immediately is could lead to big problems down the way if you haven't built these classes and objects, well, instances of the classes, such as the objects, accurately, or you've forgotten about something that was required as a relationship between different tables, then you're going to have a problem. So even as Lorenzo does in the Udacity course on the restaurant, where he goes through Flask and teaches you how to use Flask, he even starts as very basic ERDs. And for this project, the item catalogs, your ERDs, will be quite basic. But just because they're basic, it doesn't mean you shouldn't draw them. So I would recommend, without saying that you have to, I would recommend that this is the very first step. You should do it when building the item catalog. So essentially, the ERDs. Well, actually, yeah, I think I've spoken enough about them. I think you understand that the entity relationship diagram, if you've drawn it correctly, you'll know exactly what your primary key is. You'll know what your foreign keys are. You'll know the relationships between your different tables, and you'll understand, and that relationship will be depicted with cardinality. So that would be, the relationships one to many, many to one, many to many, etc. So once you've got that, then it makes your object relational mapper probably SQLalchemy that you would use. If you were using Django, you'd use the built-in ORM. But for Flask, SQLalchemy is probably the best, seeing as that's what they use in the Udacity course. It just makes it quite a far simpler process of building your ORM once your ERDs are done. And at this point, you should be really comfortable with your backend, what the database looks like, how you would create, read, and update to delete information. A good idea at this point is actually to start to build a bunch of dummy data and log into your SQLalchemy. Log into your database. Make sure that your ORM created the tables and database that you wanted, and see if you can initiate all of the operations, creating, reading, updating, and deleting. If you can't do this, then everything else you build on top is going to have problems, and it's going to be very difficult for you to figure out where the problems were. So it's a good idea to, at the completion of your ORM, to log in and start adding items, deleting them, viewing them. Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty important. And if you look again, I think I'm going to reference it a lot because it's kind of the bread and butter of this course. The Flask course that Lorenzo Brown did, he goes through exactly how to do this. So just follow exactly what he's done and get super comfortable with that. Then you're going to go into Flask, and when you start building your application with Flask, essentially what you want to keep in mind is all of the different views that you'll have. So when you're reading, when you're creating items, when you're deleting, and when you're editing or updating. So there shouldn't be anything too complex here. It's just something you have to remember by practicing. The next part is something that's pretty tricky. Like this actually, for some people, takes as much time as everything else combined. And that's because it's not as intuitive for some people as others. But essentially, you need to figure out the rules for each of your different users. So essentially, the main rule is that if you created the data, right? So sorry, there's two rules. The two main rules. The one is for authentication and the one is for authorization. So you may be logged in, but there's still rules for you. So first of all, if you're not logged in, then you can't interact with the data. So you first have to be logged in, and that's where you implementing OAuth 2. But that's not where the work stops. I think people think, oh, finally, I've successfully implemented OAuth 2. But that's not enough, unfortunately. What you have to realize is that just because somebody is logged in, it doesn't mean they can do what they want. and this is completely fair. Imagine you had built something, or like just think of, say, Facebook. Just because somebody's been logged in and Facebook knows who they are, it doesn't mean they can go and change your data. So that's essentially the step 2, the rules. This second rule, where you have to design it so that if the owner of the information is the person signed in, then the editing and deleting functionality is there. However, if the person who's logged in is not the owner of the information, they should only be able to read, view the information, not update and delete. So this is pretty important. If you get your head around it before you even start coding, that's by far the best case. So once you've done that, there's one very last thing, which is, over here, which is JSONify, right? And so it's not too complicated, but it's essentially just building API endpoints so that your application can be extended to a whole range of different use cases. So applications, Android applications, iPhone, iOS applications, server applications that have no user interface can all interact with your data. So that would be the last thing. Once you've got your authorization and authentication done, then you want to JSONify. That's near the end of the course by Lorenzo Brown, where he teaches you Flask. Essentially just importing a library. It's a really good thing to understand exactly how to do that. It's not complicated at all, but by that point you're probably near the end of building your application and you've had hit your head against the wall quite a few times. So it might seem quite difficult, but I would recommend just going back and watching that video quite a few times of Lorenzo's, where he JSONifies his restaurant's application. And then if you were able to do all of this and you're very happy, I think that it would be a good idea to just conceptually start thinking about testing. So think about, even if you don't go into testing, you don't use unit tests, you don't use PyTest, you just simply start thinking, hey, how could I use this application that I built to create errors? And if you think about it like that, you'll start to see the things that you need to double check. So some obvious ones that you want to keep in mind would be, I'll type them in just so important ones to keep in mind would be, sorry, I'm not going to type them. Form validation. So for example, if you were putting in a price or a menu item, make sure that your form, when you're building your templates, make sure that people can't put in, say, words, because then that's going to go into your database. It's going to mess up your relationships. Maybe your database was only able to create, was expecting a number, and now it got a word, and it has no idea how to do it, what to do with the word. Because, for example, if you're figuring out say a total, a sum, and then you've got some Python code that says, the sum of 23 plus car, and that's going to throw an error. And especially when you're not used to reading through the error logs, something silly and obvious like this will not seem so super silly and obvious when your brain is tired of doing all of this new stuff. So I would say that it's really important that you almost predict what the major problems will be, and this helps when you eventually start testing your applications and building testing into them. So that would be the last thing that I would do if you have the energy. But essentially all you have to get to is this point, JSONifying your application. So yeah, if there's no questions, I think I'm going to leave it there. I hope that just keeping all of these points that I've made in mind, or your own version of this, at least considering all of this and having this at the back of your mind before you jump in and start coding, will help you to build better applications, first for this project 2, and then for all of the really cool applications that you're going to be building going forward. So cool. Yeah, I hope this is useful. I'll chat to you guys in the next webinar. Okay, bye.